As we think about our founders and their worldview, let's recognize it's entirely alien to the context of historians from the 20th century on. The Enlightenment, with all of its emphasis on doubt, with its emphasis on absolute proof before you believe anything, apodictic certainty, or the idea that we can't trust anybody because everything is using tradition for power control, that historians in a Marxist perspective or in a secular perspective have had a desire to reinterpret everything within their own perspective, their doubt or the conflict of oppressor and oppressed. And so Washington would, from a Marxist viewpoint, if there's any religion, it was only as a way of manipulating people to get them. As politicians always do, we need the evangelical side so we can get elected as president. So we'll use a lot of Christian talk and get them on our side. Everybody wants to have a great hero on their side if we can get them to emphasize what we believe. The secularists want to find Washington to be a leading thinker of secular ideas of humanitarian freedom and the process of free thought and breaking from the past. And he was breaking from the old order of England that had an established church. Now we're becoming a churchless society with a godless constitution, and Washington's leading the way. We need heroes like that for our secular view. The ideology, the worldview of the era, determines how we interpret the data of the past. To be as blunt as possible, someone put it this way: the living can make the dead do any tricks they find necessary. See, the dead cannot defend themselves. And if you are in charge of history, you can make the history say what you want. That's the sad reality. So what is the retort? Especially in an era where there's no videotapes and all sorts. You got to say, well, what was the culture? What was the milieu? What was the prevailing worldview? And what are acceptable historical data that we might use to engage this process? Of course, the Enlightenment made an impact on early America. And we know the Enlightenment leads to David Hume, radical skepticism. But the Enlightenment also led to guys like John Locke, who saw himself as a Christian, who actually called the Bible an infallible book. Now, his theology is not my theology, but his philosophical efforts as he was engaging was not out of radical skepticism. He was trying to find a worldview that was a Christian Enlightenment. And could it be that Washington had a Christian Enlightenment intersection when he talks about the enlightened spirit that we have today? There's all sorts of ways in which ideology shapes the way we look at it today. Through our critical theories, we look at Washington and say, you can't trust anything this man said. He was a slave owner. Any man that owned a slave cannot possibly have any claim to truth. He's an oppressor. The oppressed must overthrow Washington. We need to get rid of his legacy. There's nothing there for us. And so ideology determines interpretation, and interpretation determines what facts you select. And because the dead cannot defend themselves, we can construct someone that fits our view and make them to be quite different, that maybe was really more authentic. Now, I can't construct the authentic Washington, but what do I have going for me? I have the fact that there's I don't know how many, 30 plus volumes, and they're big fat books of which he wrote a lot. And remember, he had to do it with a quill and, just an inkwell. This guy had to really work hard to write, and we got all these records. He was fastidious with his records. We know where he spent his money. We know when he went fox hunting. We know the names of his dogs. He wrote all this stuff. He knows what the weather was like, the phases of the moon. He was keeping track of where the records exist. He kept it for us. So he's a wonderful person to construct something of his life, where he was, what he thought, who he wrote to. And these viewpoints then do give us at least a much more reliable viewpoint than a construction based upon a new ideology. So to put it to a point, in 1932, which would have been the bicentennial of Washington, America had already begun to go through the radical shift from let's say, at least a cultural Christian intelligentsia to an authentically Enlightenment secularist mindset. I think it was Marsden who pointed out that at one point in American history, 50% of the university and college boards needed to be ministers. That all changed as we come into the 20th century. We need to get the clergy out. The seminaries cannot be in the universities. We need a rational, secular viewpoint. Let the faith groups go their own way. So, how are you going to talk about Washington if you've already made a decision you don't want Christian thought? Well, you need to have a secular Washington that's safe for a secular university context. And so Rupert Hughes is the man for the day. 1932, he's celebrating the bicentennial, not looking back with a desire to say, well, what's been the received tradition? It's like, look at all the secular facts that we need to do. And the secular George Washington is born. Hughes is quite a powerful writer, and he creates a secular Washington. And his interpretation is, in my humble opinion, the unspoken assumption point for Washington scholarship thereafter. And my challenge is, why do we start at 1932? Why don't we start at 1732, the year that Washington was born? Might they not be closer in that era to what they really believed? Why not? Why suppress all that and let someone else tell us how to look at it? So my humble opinion is ideology determines interpretation. The era of that time was far more faith-friendly than we have today. And so can we reconstruct that era from their perspective? We may not like it, but it only seems fair that we ought to hear them speak about what they thought was true. In the early 1700s, you're not that long after the Protestant Reformation, where all worship and culture changed. There was a Roman Catholic society that, with the Peace of Westphalia, became a Protestant and Catholic society that had to vie with each other. And there's a new world that's created where those values were not secondary. They were essential to define how they would build their new world. Now, economics were driven. Not everybody was a believer, but this is the worldview of the time. And Virginia is being settled by a charter and a plan that says part of your job is to establish the Anglican Church here, to have chaplains that will work with the people, that will, in fact, bring out gospel witness to the Aboriginals to begin missionary work, and to make sure that while you're doing all the plantation work that the church is built, and that we provide for the pastors and bring schools to bear, and they're bringing their culture with them. So at that time, religion was far more important because there was no government, and the order of society under the government was the local church community.